Hi, everybody. Welcome to Personal Finance, session 5. So it's now 4 o'clock, so we can get started. Again, if you have any questions, just send them on the Zoom chat and we'll cover them in the Q&A session. So great. We have a lot of good stuff planned for you today. So let's dig in. So what did we do last time? We deepened our understanding of savings and how they relate to investing. Again, savings provides you the raw material to invest. And we need to invest because if we don't, then the value of our savings tend to decline over time as the prices of goods in the economy tend to grow over time. So if we just take our money, our savings, and put them under the mattress, then we're going to lose value over time because things get more and more expensive over time. So we have to invest our money, right? And investing is really our reward for doing the hard work of savings. It's our opportunity to get more money and return for all the good work we've done in saving away our money. So we understood that also how we should think about our investments in terms of 3 buckets. There's the rainy day bucket, which is your safe money, your income generation bucket, which is your medium risk money, and then your growth bucket, which is your higher risk money, right? And so decomposing your savings into these 3 buckets was one of the core things we learned in the last session. And we're going to now, in this session, really focus on applying that framework for a hypothetical member to determine his portfolio allocation. So we're going to show you how simple it can be to create an investment strategy for yourself. And we're actually going to do this on a hypothetical member. And I'm going to try and show you that, while investing seems very complicated and confusing, it doesn't have to be. And there are ways you can construct a portfolio that are going to get you pretty good returns. And they're going to take away a lot of stress from having to having uncertainty about how to do it. So let's dig into that. So here on this page, I'm just going to walk you through our hypothetical person. And on this page, I'm showing you his financial life to date on a page, right? And this is again a hypothetical person. And you can create something similar for yourself and put in the assumptions that are appropriate for you. One aside, for members, we're going to start posting our Excel templates alongside the videos on our Learn page so that you can actually access the Excels and play around with them if you want. It can be a helpful tool for you to play around with the numbers and also customize the Excels so that they better match your profile. So let's walk through this hypothetical person. Let's understand what he's done, right? So let's pretend that this person's worked for 5 years. So I'm showing you his 5-year track record so far. He's generated after-tax income of the following levels in each year. He's done pretty well in his job. So he's gotten promotions. His income has risen pretty well. And he's done a good job. And these are in lakhs, by the way. And he's done a good job in saving his money. Each year, he saved away 1/3 of his income. So if we just take the multiplication to understand his savings and expenses, so 1/3 of 2 lakhs gets us to the 66 lakhs you see in year 1. And the balance is what are his expenses, right? So he saved 66 lakhs in year 1. He saved another 1 lakh in year 2 because he earned 3 lakhs. 1/3 of 3 lakhs is 1 lakh. So he saved another 1 lakh here, 1.32 lakhs here. So one number that we can look at is simply how much he saved each year added up cumulatively. So if I just do that, we can see at the end of 5 years, he saved 6.6 lakhs total. Now, let's pretend this person was a little bit scared of investing, didn't know how to do it. And as a result, all this person did was put it into a long-term fixed deposit, all of his savings, and he earned an investment return of 5%, let's just say, just hypothetically, right? To just look at some numbers. So we can look at what his total corpus looks like at the end of year 5. So the corpus starts at 0, right? Then he saves 66 lakhs in that year. So it increases by 66 lakhs. Then on that 66 lakhs, right, he earns a return. And I'm assuming here just 5% for simplicity. It will actually be a little lower than that, maybe.
0.66 lakhs.
Sorry, 0.66 lakhs, right. 66,000, right. Apologies for that. But he gets a 5% return on that 66,000. I assumed here that this 66,000 is invested throughout the year. So on average, he only gets that return for half of the year, right? Because he earns that money throughout the year, not all at the beginning of the year. So that gives us a return of 2,000 rupees. So he ends the year at 68,000 rupees in corpus. So in the next year, he begins with that 68,000 of corpus. He saves another 1 lakh. And he also generates another return at 5%. So he ends the year at 1.73. So if we continue this forward with these assumptions, at the end of year 5, we're left with a corpus value of 7.3 lakhs. So this is kind of what our hypothetical person has done life to date. Now let's say that this person continued to do this throughout his career, that he didn't invest, but he in anything other than a fixed deposit, and he just kept doing the strategy and did not invest in equity or other products. What would the consequences of this be? So here we have our first 5 years, and then I just built out all the years up till year 40. So we're assuming here that the person worked for 40 years, right? We want to know how much was his corpus value when he retired. So if I just carry this calculation forward, we see that the person does pretty well in nominal terms. So at year 40, he's actually got a corpus of almost 11 crores, 10.5 crores. So we can say that, wow, he didn't do much, he didn't take a lot of risk, and he retired, with 10 crores worth of corpus. That looks pretty good. That may be true, but the important thing to count here is the value of the rupee and the impact of inflation. So what I've shown here at the bottom is the value of 1 rupee at a 5% inflation rate. So in year 1, that 1 rupee is worth 1 rupee. In year 2, it's worth 5% less because prices have risen 5%. So it's only worth 95 paisa, then 91 paisa, then 86 paisa. And if you take this all the way forward, you get to 15 paisa in year 40. So that's how powerful a force inflation can be. Now, if we do nothing else, but just say, okay, that 10 crores that he has as a corpus in year 40, if we calculate the value of that in today's money, right? And we say, okay, how much can I actually buy with that 10 crores, accounting for the fact that prices are going up? It's equivalent to, so basically all I did was take this 10 crores, multiplied it by 15 paisa, and I got 156 lakhs, so 1.6 lakhs. So really his corpus is worth about 1.6 lakhs in today's money, okay? So that corpus value, when you account for inflation,
1.6 crores.
1.6 crores, sorry. When you account for inflation, is not nearly as impressive as the numbers look on a nominal basis. And that's a very important thing that you're going to want to calculate when you do your own retirement planning, to make sure you account for inflation. Now we can ask a very simple question, right? Which is, okay, let's say this person wanted to retire, right? And his goal in retirement was he did not want to eat away into his corpus. He wanted his investment returns to fund his expense requirements. We can look at how much he would have to cut his expenses to fund so that his corpus could generate that return for him. So we're assuming he's generating a 5% pre-tax return. So the income generation of the corpus at 5% post-tax, if you take this 10 crores, multiply it by 5% post-tax, you get 36 lakhs of income generated a year. Now, his expenses in year 40 were 1.1 crores, right? So in order for him to sustain his corpus, he would need to reduce his expenses by 67.5%. So he would almost need to reduce his expenses by 70% in order to maintain his corpus. So this shows you why this is not a great strategy and why you need to invest in a riskier asset class in addition to FDs to really see your wealth preserved. So now let's design a strategy for the person. So the first thing is we want to figure out what this person's goals are, right? Because anytime you design a strategy, you want to make sure that that strategy matches the hypothetical person's goals. So let's say that the person wanted to have 0% cut in his expenses, right? He wants to keep his corpus intact without cutting his expenses in year 41. So that's one parameter we're going to solve for, right? And then the other things that he wants to do is he wants to keep enough safe money on hand so that he's not forced to sell assets at low prices like we discussed in the last video. He needs a rainy day bucket that we discussed, right? So we recommended 6 months of your expenses should be covered in your rainy day bucket. So we're going to say that this member is going to do that also. This person's going to do that. And then we are going to determine the other buckets by trying to meet that goal. We want the other buckets to be sized based on how large they need to be to hit our goal of not eating into our corpus. So let's work through the math, right? So here again, I have my income assumptions, right? I'm assuming, by the way, that the person's income grows 10% a year throughout his career. Savings rate, I'm keeping at 33%. Right? And then you have your savings and expenses in each year again. Now, for the safe bucket, again, I'm sizing that to be equal to a half year's worth of expenses. So you can see that it grows over time as the person's expenses increase, but it's equal to half of the annual expense number. So let's take year 8 as an example. The rainy day bucket is equal to 5.35 lakhs divided by 2, so 2.68 lakhs is how much we're keeping in our rainy day bucket. And that obviously changes over time. Now the return I'm assuming on the safe bucket, I'm assuming 4% return here. And income source bucket, I'm assuming a 7% return. And the growth bucket, I'm assuming a 12% return. And you can think of these as sort of post-tax returns, not pre-tax returns. Okay, so those are kind of assumptions I've assumed on the returns. And in terms of how I allocated between the income source bucket and the growth bucket, again, was I was solving for this math here. I wanted the income generation of the corpus to exactly match my last year expenses. So that's where you can see they do, right? So my post-tax return, assuming this strategy, gives me income of 113 lakhs, which matches my last year expenses of 113 lakhs. So in this scenario, I am able to meet my expenses through my investment income generation, right? And I'm doing this and keeping my corpus intact. And I did this by allocating 75% of my remaining assets after my safe bucket to the growth bucket and 25% to the income source bucket. So that's how I kind of divided this. We got a question from a member about how you allocate between the two. So I'm just giving you a simple example of how you can run the math to allocate for yourself. Now, one of the questions you could have is, well, you know, what about inflation as your expenses increase post-retirement? So the assumption we're making on inflation is the corpus will cover any inflation that the member sees, right? So he will eat into his corpus over time to cover inflation under the assumptions we're assuming here, but it does not require a cut in expenses day one. Okay, so I just want to now just take a very simplistic high level view of what we did, right? Because we walked through a lot of numbers. And again, these Excels will be available for members to play around with. But I just want to just recap how we did this. So the first thing was we figured out what the person's goals were. This person wanted to make sure that they could fund their post-retirement lifestyle without cutting expenses, right? So we designed a plan that did that, right? So we back solved into where we would need to allocate money in order to meet that objective. And now what we need to do is design an investment strategy that fits into that, right? But before doing that, I want to cover some very important principles in investing that we think all members should kind of think about as they plan their own portfolios. So the first principle that I want to cover is called the principle of diversification. You may have heard of this. It's a very common term that's used in investing. But the basic principle here is easy to understand. Basically means don't put all your eggs in a single basket. So as we discussed, there is risk with any investment, right? Even a simple FD can have risk. So if you're putting your money in a risky bank, fixed deposit can be risky, right? So diversification lessens the impact of any single one investment going bad. So I'm giving you a very simple example here. So let's say that I made an investment that lost 40% of its value. If it was my only investment, then I would have had a 40% reduction in my portfolio value. That's a huge loss, right? But if I had a portfolio of 3 stocks, right, and 2 of them generated 10% returns, 1 generated a 40% loss, my blended return is only a 7% loss. And if I actually had 10 stocks, right, then I would only have a 5% gain. And so when we're investing, the importance of diversification is spreading your bets so you don't take too much risk on any one single bet, right? So oftentimes I ask, well, how much should I diversify? Well, the answer to that question is really how confident are you in your bets? The more research you've done, the more conscious you are of all the risks you're taking and your comfort level with those risks, that will answer how much you need to diversify. Because diversification is not without its costs, right? Because the opposite scenario also holds. If you had one investment that did really, really well, if you diversified, the impact of that investment doing really, really well would also go down. So how much you diversify is really a personal question based on how comfortable you are with the work you've done to analyze your investments. If you haven't done a lot of work, you should be very broadly diversified. So the other thing I want to cover is what diversification can do and what it can't do. So there are really 3 types of risks that most investments have, right? So one is macro market risks. So this is kind of like broader economic risks, wars, pandemics, etc., like what we're seeing now that affect the entire market of investments, right? Diversification can't protect you from these because all investments suffer from them. So if the entire stock market is down 20%, 30%, some stocks will be down more than others, but it's unlikely that your portfolio of stocks is going to be flat or up, right? Because all stocks are getting hit. Now let's take industry risks, right? So there's sometimes risks that impact one single industry. So for example, if you read our note on UPL, right, one of the stocks that we analyzed, one of the risks with UPL is a draft regulation that is being contemplated right now, banning some fertilizers, right? So if that happens, companies like UPL stock price will be hit, but other stock prices won't be hit, right? So diversification can protect you from these kind of industry specific risks if you had diversified across many industries. Then company specific risks also, diversification can protect you from. And what are company specific risks? If there's mismanagement at the company, if, for example, there's a recall of products, or a company borrowed too much and can't pay its debts back, then that particular company is going to be hit, but the broader market won't be. So even when you diversify, it's important to recognize that diversification cannot protect you from everything. And that's why it's really important as you design your investment strategy that you acknowledge the fact that diversification still exposes you to certain risks, and your best uh, protection against those risks is making sure you have an adequate rainy day fund bucket, making sure you have a big enough savings bucket that protects you if bad things happen in the broader economy. So that's why it's really important to have that rainy day bucket and it be large enough. So again, we recommend 6 months of your expenses should be covered in that bucket. Okay, the other principle I want to cover, and it's something we've discussed before, but it's so important, and a lot of people don't appreciate this, that I want to cover it again. It's very tempting to think that we can do better than the market, right? You know, at Barossa, we are trying to do better than the market in our small case, for example, and we think we can because we're putting a lot of work into it, but it's really difficult to do. And most people who try fail. That's the honest truth about active fund management. So I'm just showing you returns in the US, which looked at passive strategies versus active strategies. So a passive strategy is just investing in the market, right? Buying an ETF that tracks the overall Nifty, for example. An active strategy is picking specific industries or companies and trying to beat the market. So what this shows is that after fees, most in the US, there's really no contest. On average, passive funds, which are in the blue line here, have dramatically outperformed active funds. So it's really tempting to think we can beat the market, but the fact is most people do not beat the market. And this is a very underappreciated principle. So I want to make sure that you guys spend some time thinking about what is the right strategy for you. The other principle that we recommend that members adhere to when they're designing their investment portfolios is one called keep it simple, stupid, right? There are thousands of complicated investment options and schemes in the market. How do you make sense of them, right? So the good news that we have for members is you don't need to bother about all these options and schemes in the market. Why? Because if you remember, one of our core principles that we covered is in any market, it is very difficult to find bargains, right? And similarly in the investment market, it is very hard to find great risk rewards in the investment market. So the corollary of this is if something looks too good to be true, it probably is. You're probably missing some risks that you are taking that you cannot see at that moment. And you really need to study these uncommon investment options very carefully. So I'll give you an example of Franklin Templeton's fund, right? So a lot of people were tempted to invest in Franklin Templeton's fund because they saw the excess return it was getting versus other similar debt funds. Now it's apparent how they were getting that excess return. They were investing in riskier companies, and that's caused the liquidity issues that we see in that fund, right? So the best way to think about investing, in our opinion, is stick with common investment products, equity mutual funds, debt mutual funds, government bonds, PPF, gold, and don't chase return. Basically, chase investments that you understand the risks of. The more complicated an investment, the more easy it is to miss the hidden risks of investing in that asset. One of the things that you'll see is, that some of this math has shown you, you don't need to generate outstanding returns to have a comfortable retirement. You can do it with decent returns. And in the long run, most people that follow that strategy will actually do better. Even here, one of the things that we recommend is even something like real estate, while it's proven to be a reasonable investment for a lot of people in India, it comes with a lot of headaches, black money, transaction costs, stamp duty, if you're buying it as an investment, finding a renter, dealing with the renter, making sure that you fix problems in the apartment, etc. Our advice on this is, why take the headache? You have simpler investment options out there that still give you good returns, and you don't need to take the headache of property ownership with those investments. So unless you think you're getting a really, really good risk reward in real estate, we recommend don't take the hassle on. Just keep your investment portfolio very simple and you'll do just fine. So now let's take these principles and design a strategy for our hypothetical member. So, okay, we had our safe bucket where we needed to generate a long-term return of 4%. So a mixed strategy of short-term FDs and overnight funds over the long run in a normalized interest rate environment should be able to get us around 4% return. Obviously not in today's market because interest rates are low, but over a normalized period of time, that should be sufficient for our safe bucket. On the income generation bucket, the strategy that we're going to employ here is maximize your PPF, right? Because as we covered in the last session, PPF gives you a very good return post-tax. And once you've done that, put 50% of the balance in government bonds, tax-free government bonds, which will give you, say, 5-6%, and 50% of the balance in dividend stocks, which will blend to, say, a 7% return that we've assumed, or even higher, given the equity component you're taking. And for our growth bucket, we're going to put 50% in Nifty 100 ETF and 50% in the NASDAQ tracking ETF. Now this strategy, right, very simple, very diversified. You're in a mix of assets, and you're not taking punts on individual stocks in huge ways, but broad baskets of stocks, and you're tracking the market in your growth bucket. So you're well diversified, you have adequate safety in your safe bucket, and this will give you peace of mind for this member, right? And he'll achieve his goals without taking too much stress on in life, which is one of the things that we recommend for people. Finances can be extremely stressful when they don't work your way. So you want to make sure that you design your portfolio not just for return, but also for peace of mind. So I want to also cover a few deeper insights that you can get by playing around with the numbers that we modeled here. So again, I'm going to upload these Excels onto our website so you can play around with the numbers yourself, changing return assumptions or savings rates and all. But here are some of my deeper assumptions when I played around with the number. The first is the importance of the savings rate. If all we did was increase a person's savings rate from 33 to 40%, he or she would retire 20% richer. That is astonishing to me, because 7% more tucked away on your income is not a hell of a lot, right? But if you can manage your lifestyle a little bit cheaper in the early years of your life, you can retire in much more comfort and security, right? So that's a very, very important principle and takeaway for me. As I think about managing my own lifestyle, this is one of the things I am really focused on, is making sure my lifestyle does not get, my habits do not become too expensive. Because if I get accustomed to that lifestyle, it makes my financial position more precarious, right? So the other one is that investing well is very important, right? So every 1% delta in your rate of return has impact of increasing, decreasing retirement wealth by 15%, right? And the last key takeaway for me and deep insight for me is that it takes time for compounding to work. If you look at our math that we covered earlier, it took a very long time for the corpus to become impressive levels of wealth, right? But the key is consistency and patience and avoiding having to sell at low prices. If all you do is you manage to avoid having to sell your assets through crashes like we're seeing now, and keeping your money well diversified, avoiding individual stocks you don't understand, it is almost impossible for you not to accumulate significant amounts of wealth in the long run, assuming our economy does well, right? Because that will naturally increase the output of companies and raise the price level of your investments. So I'd love for you guys to play around with the Excels and get a flavor intuitively of how these numbers all stack out. But that just gives you a flavor of the style of analysis you can do to create your own investment portfolio. And I hope this helped you kind of think through how to go about something daunting like constructing an investment strategy. So next time what we're going to do is we're going to cover some investing traps, so do's and don'ts based on our advice. We're also going to discuss active investing and who it's right for. See, while passive investing, in my opinion, is right for 90 to 95% of people, I use an active strategy in my own portfolio. And it can be right for some people that have a lot of patience, time, and bent to do deep research on things and like thinking about things deeply. So I'll also cover a little bit of that in next class and how you can, what types of people should do active investing and what the next steps for them can be in getting and doing it well. And the final recommendations that we have on the investing pillar. And then we'll introduce our next pillar that we're going to cover, which is borrowing. So in the class. So great. With that, I'll open it up to the Q&A. Anita, you want to ask the questions?
Right. Is it right to say that post-retirement for the hypothetical person, their corpus worked for them and replaced salary?
Yes, it is right to say that. The only caveat to that is the corpus in the example that we demonstrated here does not only work to replace the salary, it also covers inflation, right? Because prices will rise after retirement also. Your expenses also tend to go down, which is why we were comfortable with that sort of math in this hypothetical that we showed. But yes, that's exactly right.
Okay. So the next question is, does a person who's not retired need to invest in the income bucket?
Very, very good question. So you may look at the math and say, why on earth would I invest in the income generation bucket at all? Because I'm getting a 7% return versus a 12% return in the growth bucket in our assumptions that we showed. So why would I ever take a 7% return versus a 12% return if I don't need the money? So the answer to that question is, I am a big fan personally of taking the least amount of risk that you need to take to meet your objectives. So while the person could, in our example, could have allocated 100% to the growth bucket and chased higher returns and would have, in our mathematically, been more wealthy at the end of the analysis, he didn't need to do that and to meet his objectives. And the benefit that that gives you is better peace of mind and security, right? Because if you're in things like government bonds and dividend paying stocks, etc., you tend to have less volatility in your portfolio than if you're in high growth stocks and chasing returns. So if the unexpected happens and God forbid your rainy day fund doesn't cover you on unexpected stress that you see in your financial life that comes up, right? Which happens all the time. Like I'll give you an example of myself, right? I have a property in the United States, right? Which is now, there's some plumbing issues that are impacting one of my neighbors. I didn't see this expense coming, right? So, life constantly throws us curveballs, and the more resiliency you bake into your portfolio, the better. So it's not just about getting wealthier in the long run. It's about matching your risk that you're taking to the rewards. And this person didn't need to take that much risk to put everything in a 100% growth bucket. So that's kind of the reason that we didn't put everything in a growth bucket. But that would also be a fine strategy. It just introduces more risk.
So on diversification, should I have 1 mutual fund, 3 mutual funds, 10 mutual funds?
Yeah. So it's less about how many mutual funds. It's a good question. It's more about what those mutual funds are invested in. So one of the things that's very important to do when you look at your mutual fund holdings is understand what they are invested in, what industries they're invested in, what the largest stock is as a percentage of the total portfolio. And that will help you understand how truly diversified you are. So if, for example, 50% of one of your mutual funds is invested in BFSI, then you're basically investing in a BFSI sector fund, right? It's very high exposure in financials. Now that could be part of your strategy. It could be that, hey, I think BFSI is a very, very good bet, right? And I want that exposure. That's fine. You've done your homework, you understand the risks of doing it, and you want that exposure. But the mistake a lot of people make is they'll invest in 3-4 funds that are doing well without realizing and thinking they're diversifying, without realizing that all of them have done well because they've all taken exposure to the same industry which has done well. So they're actually not as diversified as they think. So my advice to the member that asked that is, if you look at the mutual funds and understand what the industry mix is, understand how much risk you're taking in each industry, and make sure that's balanced. You don't want to see a fund that is overexposed to certain industries unless you believe those industries are going to do really, really well and you want that exposure.
Okay, so there's a question, should we be avoiding government bonds?
I think that, so one of the principles we covered was that in the market, generally things are priced correctly, right? So that means even a government bond, the yield that it's paying you and the price that the government bond is trading at will reflect the current expectations of what return it needs to give you relative to the risk you're taking, right? Mispricings do happen in the market, but they're very rare and difficult to find. So with that principle, I don't think necessarily you should say avoid government bonds unless you have a very strong view as to why you should avoid government bonds. So, there are circumstances where you'd want to avoid government bonds. If you believe inflation, with all the stimulus and global liquidity that's happened in the world, if you believe prices are going to rise faster than 5% a year, right? Then a government bond may not be a very good deal because you're getting a fixed interest rate. So there are scenarios where you want to avoid government bonds if you have a specific view on the economy. Otherwise, what I recommend is don't take too much exposure to government bonds, right? Just balance across bonds, dividend paying stocks, growth stocks. The answer to that question really comes down to, do you have a concrete view? Why? Do you believe that that's going to be the case? If not, it's okay to have government bonds, just make sure you're diversified. So in our example, for example, the person didn't put all of their money into government bonds, right? They put 50% in government bonds, 50% into dividend stocks of that income bucket, right? So they had good levels of diversification.
The next question is, passive versus active, does that hold good during this current digital world where we have plenty of data and information?
Really good question. So we have a lot of information, but I could actually argue that, and a lot of economists do argue, that the more widely information is available democratically, anyone can go on the internet and pull the information, right? It's not just us. The more that is true, the more efficient markets become. So what does efficient mean in terms of markets? It means that when new information comes out on a stock, the stock price reacts correctly, right? So the wider the information is available, the more efficient markets tend to become. So actually, digital availability of information is making it harder to generate good active returns, not easier, because that information is more democratically available. In the past, right, you may, for example, work in an industry, right, where, let's say I work in FMCG, right, and I work for Parle-G, and I know how Britannia's products are selling in the channels, because I'm selling the same products to the same customers, and I know that products are doing really, really well, right? I have an advantage over other people in the market, right? Because not everyone knows that information. But in today's day and age, that information is more widely available to lots and lots of people. So for example, there are actually data sources like AC Nielsen that track these sales. So everyone has access to this information, and this information gets priced into the market more efficiently. So look, I am a believer that really smart, dutiful research with a differentiated view that's supported by facts, you can generate good active returns. But I've done it, worked in trying to do this for a long time in my career, and I know how difficult it is, right? It is very, very difficult to do and requires a lot of homework on your end, and there's still no guarantees you'll do it. So unless you're willing to put in a lot of time and thinking on your end, active management in terms of you picking individual stocks on your own is not something I recommend. I'll discuss how you can do active management in a compromised fashion by picking a fund manager that you understand their strategy, you agree with their strategy, and you let them do the hard work of analyzing the stocks. That's an approach that you can do for some people. But again, for the bulk of people, I recommend a passive strategy.
Okay, so I'm currently 37 years old. By 55, I want to become financially independent. What kind of investment should I start with now?
So good questions. So what I would recommend for the person that asked this, look at the Excel sheet that we created, right? Really spend some time in trying to understand it. If you're a member, download the Excel sheet and try to build one for yourself. If you run into stumbling blocks, feel free to email us at advisory@Bharosa. I can help you out in terms of answering general questions about making the spreadsheet right for you. But here are some tips that will not be so obvious, right? That I think can help people retire early. So the first is, remember one of our deep insights that really the savings rate is one of the most important variables that we have. Why is that? Because as your savings rate goes up, your expense declines, right? That's the only way you can save more, by spending less, right? If you're earning the same amount, right? So that does two things. One, it gives you more money to invest and generate higher returns on. But equally important, it gets you habituated to a lower lifestyle of living, which is very, very valuable in the long run. I'll give you an example. When I moved to India from the US about 3.5 years ago, I found it oppressively hot in Mumbai. The first thing I did was I said, Chalo, I'm going to try to survive the summer without the AC. Why? Because I wanted to build a habit that I could tolerate the heat. I saw so many people doing it in India, surviving in Mumbai with a fan, and I couldn't even think of doing it, right? But I made myself do it. So I knew that the AC is a luxury, not a necessity. Because having habits like this gives you an enormous amount of flexibility. That's one of the quickest ways to retire early. Just need less when you retire. If you're going to want to drive a Mercedes Benz and you're going to want to fly all over the place and stay in 5-star hotels and all those things, you're going to be working for a very, very long time, and you're always going to be worried about ye market crash, wo market crash, all those things. If on the other hand, you live frugally, you save a lot, you focus on, enjoying life in a low cost manner, not depriving yourself, but being balanced, that's one of the best ways to retire early. And the next is, the deep insight I have for retiring early is, do not take huge amounts of risk. One of the worst ways to risk your financial independence is by overextending yourself, investing in something you don't understand, which promises you, getting rich quickly, or putting too much of your money into something where you don't have safety. These are great ways of ruining your finances, and it's just not worth it. Don't try and get rich quickly. Try and get rich slowly. That's how you're gonna do it safely.
Okay, so I think Sanjay, you may want to take this question, the next one. With regard to NPS, I think there are many people who are not positive about it. However, if we are in the 30% tax bracket and if we invest 50,000 per year per the ATD limit, we can easily save 15K from tax itself in the long run every year. What's your thought process on the same?
Yeah, so, on NPS, the thing why some people don't like it is that one, your money is locked up for a very long time. And then the adjustment to how much goes into equity and how much goes into debt is based on your age. So you are losing a certain amount of flexibility. So let's say, you were young and COVID happened. Right now, it won't move from equity to debt, and that might affect your savings, your retirement corpus. Or if the reverse happened, like we went through a major bull market, it's going to keep selling your equity right from the stage that you reached 40 or 50 and keep adjusting it till you retire at 60. Okay, so for some people, this lack of control and the way NPS controls it is not a positive. But for other people, it's a positive, right? Because they're saying, hey, I don't have to worry about it. The NPS is taking care of it. And, the expenses also for managing this are very, very low, since NPS manages a lot of government pensions and things like that. So the expenses are low and I don't have to worry about it. So that's the positive side. Now, so for those who like this aspect of NPS, and then the final thing is that when you do retire or after 60, your NPS money is given to you in a kind of annuity form. So it's meant like a salary replacement. There are certain things which you get immediately, and there is not a whole lot of clarity on this. Will you end up paying tax on that? So a lot of people are hoping that, there's going to be no tax and there'll be a little more flexibility in case you need the money. And you'll have the choice of taking a lump sum or more of a lump sum and not an annuity. So what I would say on NPS is you need to study it and also remember that if you start investing in it, then you're locking up money for a long time and you're not 100% certain what will happen to that money. I mean, it'll be good. It's not that it's because it's a government program, but it'll not necessarily be very flexible. So that's why, sort of putting in large sums of money in NPS is not something that I think is a very good thing to do. But like Raksha said, that, there is a special tax exemption for NPS where you can invest 50,000 and you get 15,000. Now that's attractive because you can't get that 15,000 tax saving elsewhere. So for those who are willing to take the effort to study NPS and sort of learn it, then it may be a good idea to put that 50,000 or whatever where you get that tax thing and just keep your NPS going. Okay, so that may not be a bad thing to do, because certainly with the 15,000 that you save on taxes, your returns could be quite positive from NPS. It's just that if you have fairly large sums of money, then the extra hassle that NPS may cause may not be worth it. But for quite a few people, I think it's fine. So I'm
Yeah.
not sure if that answers your question or not. But yeah.
I think just to add on a little bit to what Sanjay said, in terms of figuring out if special schemes like this that have tax advantaged status, or lock-ins, etc., make sense for your particular situation, the real questions you got to ask yourself is, are you in a high tax bracket, right? Because the tax exemption is going to have more benefit if you're in a high tax bracket. Can you deal with the liquidity disadvantages and lock-ins, etc.? And how does that post-tax return compare to other post-tax returns that you can earn for yourself? And how do the restrictions compare? There's no blanket statement per se that holds true for everybody, right? Government bonds, right, can be a great investment for somebody. It can be a terrible investment for somebody, depending on a variety of things. One, what are your goals in life, right? Two, what is your outlook on investing environment, and three, what is your investment time horizon, right? So all these things that we covered actually in the last class, if you put the NPS into that framework, it will help you compare that investment option versus others that you have for the same bucket of money. So really what you got to do is compare NPS, right, to other substitute investments that you would consider instead of that vehicle.
Okay, there's one question later on NPS, which basically says that I'm going to get a 70K pension at 60 onwards. I think you have to be careful with that because NPS is not a guaranteed pension scheme. So there is no number. These are indicative numbers. So if the NPS corpus does well, you may get 70K or pension or 70,000, or you may get more, or you may get less. So it's very important that you understand what you are getting into and do it slowly, get the statements, understand it, talk to people, look at newspaper reports, etc., and understand what you're doing.
So I think that was it. There were no more questions. Yeah, that's it for now.
Okay, great. So we will continue on with our series in 2 weeks. Also, I'd say for members, please come in with suggestions of the advanced sessions that you want to see. One of the things that we've thought about is just doing a Q&A type session where every 2 weeks we cover one question from a member in a video, right? So it can be analyzing a particular stock that the member wants us to analyze, or this or that. Any question that we feel that other members would benefit from, we'll address, right? And thought that might be an interesting idea for another video session. So want you guys to just gestate on that thought. Let us know what you think. And if you have any other suggestions of what we do for our advanced video series. So look forward to seeing you guys again on our next session, and hope this was helpful. See you all. Bye-bye.